All right, so now that we know all the background things we need to know, I'm actually going to do some cleanup here. So I'm going to close all these JavaScript files that I did to explain you imports and exports. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of those JavaScript files. And you'll see that Parcel also created like a cache folder and a dist folder. It's going to recreate these anyways. If we delete it, it doesn't matter. So what I'll do here, see we have this main HTML. I'm actually going to rename this and call this index.html. We don't have to, but let's just go with a better convention here. And then I'll link to index.js file, which I'm also going to create here. And then finally, because now I renamed this to index.html, I'm going to go to my package.json and change this serve command to do index.html as my input. And as you can see, it's already giving me the error that main HTML does not exist. But for now, I'm going to actually do Control-C to get out of Parcel. Let me actually delete these two too, just to keep this clean and nice. So generally speaking, all I did at this point, I just have my package.json. I have Parcel installed as a dev dependency right here. And then I've created an index.html file where I just did a regular boilerplate and I just did a div with an ID app and I linked to my index JavaScript file, which is located right here in the same folder. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and install React. So to install React, I'm going to do npm install. So I'm not going to do that D because we actually need React when we actually deploy our app. So we're going to install React, and then we're going to install a second package that's called React DOM. Now, we could just run this like this and then type another npm install React DOM. Those are two separate packages. Or another shortcut is to simply just comma separate two packages or three packages, not comma, but space. So if you wanted more, you could just do your packages here, right? I just want these two. Done. So again, I'm going to clear this. So now we have React installed. And if we go to our package.json, you'll see that it will basically tell us that we have those dependencies. So at this point, I'm going to go back to my index.js. And if you remember, we don't do anything here. We're going to do everything in JavaScript. So to be able to use React, we need to actually import React. So to do that, we're going to do import React from React. And you can see that here, I don't do that dot and all of this because we're not importing this from our current folder files. We're actually importing that from this node modules. And we have it in the node modules because we just installed it. And the second thing I'm going to import here is React DOM. Now in React, there is a way to create elements which are what we call React elements. To keep that simple for now, just think about it the same way as creating our element. So for example, a second ago when I had to create an element, I had to do document create element, and then I passed the element to be h1, and then I had to save it in a variable, and then add some text content to it and do all this stuff to get my h1 element in there. So let me actually just write that as a reference here, the way I did that before. We're not going to be using any of this code. I'll just have it here as a reference. So this is how we did it to add that h1 to our app. Now I'm just going to comment all of that. Now in React, now we have this import React. So if we do React dot, and you can see that we also have create element that creates a React element, not an HTML element. And you can see that the first thing is the type. So again, if I wanted to do an h1, I would do h1. Pretty much exactly the same way I just did it in here. See? Now this also has other parameters that we can pass, and that is properties object. So that properties object basically will be like a JavaScript object that will let us do this sort of stuff, like when we have to add the property ID or the class name. To do that, we'll basically just do ID title, and then comma, and then class name, red. That's the title. That's this, comma. And the third argument here is children. So basically, what's the child of this, h1? And in this case, that's just going to be our text. So I'm just going to pass this text. So basically, this kind of makes this 4 lines as a one-liner. So we have this React element. So I'm just going to save this in a variable. So at this point, we want to do this when we append this as a child inside of this app, so it renders it on the page. And to do that, this is where we have to use this React DOM to actually put this inside of this app. So we're just going to take that React DOM, and this has this method render. And as you can see, it's going to accept the element here and the container. So the element is going to be this h1. So I'm going to pass that h1 here, comma. And the container is going to be this div with an ID app. So basically, we could just uncomment this and have this app and pass it here. Also, like, this shouldn't be create element. This should be get element by ID. So we're going to get that. This is where we're going to pass it. And we have this h1 React element that we're basically telling it to put it inside of this app. So let's just run our npm start all over again because we stopped it. And let's try to open this. And as you can see, I got that h1, my text. If I inspect it, so you can see what that HTML looks like. We have that app, and we have this h1 with an ID title, class red, and the text is my text. Which, as you can see, is not really much better than doing what I used to do here. However, what's great about this, I'm going to remove all of those comments at this point, is that React has this thing built in that's called JSX. That's going to make this whole thing a lot easier. So instead of doing what I just did here, this is what I could have done. I could have done const h1 equals, and then I can do h1, and then my text, and then right here we'll do ID. It's going to be title, and class name will be red. So this should look a lot more like HTML to you, but this is not really HTML. This is what we call JSX, and it's basically something that makes your JavaScript look like HTML, but it's really still JavaScript. So I'm going to comment this line and just keep this one instead. And if I save this, you'll see that it works exactly the same way. I still got this. One thing I want you to pay attention to is that here it says class red. Here we have class name red. Because if you remember, when I was going through different properties available, there was no property class. There is a property class name. Because class is kind of like a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so we use class name. So another thing that we could do, we could actually create a function that returns this. Instead of just saving this in a variable h1, we could have a function that returns that. So for example, I could create a function called header. And then in this function, we could just simply return this. I'm going to get rid of all of that. Now at this point, this is that function called header. So I could just pass it here to run that function. And remember, I can't do this because this is a function. So if I do this, this is not going to run the function. If I save this and go back, you'll see that this doesn't work. So if I want this to work, I need that function here to run. And to run that, we need to do this open and close parentheses. So if I do this and save this, go back and take a look, you'll see that we get our text because we actually run that particular function header. We get the return, which is this, which is basically like a shortcut to do all of this. So instead of us creating the element, adding the properties, adding the internal text, we can just basically do the shortcut JSX way of building that automatically. So that's what it does behind the scenes. And then we can simply just run that, get that return, and put it in here, and we put it inside of this app. Now, I'm just gonna get this out of the way here. I'm just gonna cut this and put it directly in here and remove it out of here. That's the way you will probably see it in most cases. And there it is. It should still work. We got our function that we render here. What we could do, we could actually now take this function and put it in a separate file, pretty much the same way we did before. So I can just go here and create another JavaScript file, and I'm gonna call it header.js. And again, as you remember, the name of this file doesn't really matter that much, but probably a good idea to name it the same thing you're gonna call. And then over here, I'm gonna basically just grab all of this and paste it here. And then to be able to get to that, we're gonna do export default that function header. Now remember that you may see people write this in a couple of different ways. You can have this written like this, like function header, or it can be as an arrow function. So it could be something like const header equals, and you have this arrow function. That's the same thing as the other one. So this or the other, just use whichever one you like. I kind of prefer this notation for this sort of stuff, but it's really up to you. So now I need to get access to this function from the other files. So you probably already know what we're going to do. We're going to go here and import it. So we're going to do import that header function from that file from the current folder called header. And then we should be able to run this function over here, and it should get us the same thing. So if I save this, go back, well, probably not exactly. There's one problem we're gonna have, but let's just save this and go take a look. So as you can see, this doesn't work. We get an error. If I go to console, see it says React is not defined. So the reason I get this error that React is not defined is because if I go back to the file that I've just created, this header.js, we did this thing, h1 id title class name. And if you remember, this is equivalent to me doing like react.create element and then kind of have that h1 and do all of that. So that's like a shortcut way of getting to the same thing. Now, if I type this, it doesn't know what React is here. Now, as you can see, my autocomplete automatically actually imported this here on top to fix that problem for me, but I didn't really have this line on top there. So let me actually get rid of it. So this is the problem, that it's not going to know what this React is, and therefore it's not going to work. For that to work, we need to do what my autocomplete did for me a second ago, which I didn't want it to do, but I did it anyways. So we'll do React from React. And we don't need that second one, React DOM, because that one we only use over here to render on the page. Here, we don't do that. We only use this part when we create the element and add attributes and all of that stuff. So now if I do this import, this line should be able to do what it needs to do, and it's going to return what it needs to return, and everything should work just fine. We'll import it here in this other file. Let's actually just cut this comment and put it in this file just for future reference. And if I go back and take a look, it should still work. We should have my text here on this page. Another interesting thing about JSX, which is this thing that we have here, is that JSX also has an interesting way that it provides to run functions. So if you can see here, I did this function header that I import here, and then I run that function by doing this parentheses. Now, JSX has another way of doing the syntax, which does exactly the same thing. We can do this HTML-like syntax to call this same header function. So if you do this, it should get us the same thing. This should now run that header function again, and we should get the same results. And as you can see, it works just fine, no problem. So one thing you want to remember is that in JSX, if you're trying to create a function and run it with this notation, you must name your function with an uppercase letter, because lowercase ones, like see this H1 and things like that, they are reserved for internal properties and stuff. So for our functions, if we want to be able to run it using this JSX syntax, we need to make it uppercase. So if I do lowercase header for this function instead of uppercase header, and then export that header, again, lowercase. If I go back here and import that header and try to run that header here in lowercase, save it, this is not going to work. See, it doesn't run because it must be uppercase for JSX to be able to run it. Now we could still run it the other way. So I can still just call that function like this, header and open close parentheses, like the JavaScript way of doing that. And if I save this and go back, you'll see this still works and it renders the text. But if you don't do it that way, it's not going to work. So usually you'll see people use the JSX syntax for this. And that's why you'll see this uppercase of some sort. And here you'll have that header that looks sort of like an HTML. And that should work just fine. Apparently, I didn't rename all of those correctly. Let's go back and, oh, this one, see, the export. Uppercase, save it, go back. More, yeah, here, uppercase. See, so many errors now. There it is, now it works. Okay. The next thing I want to show you is how do we pass arguments to this function. So remember, the way we pass arguments and things like that. So maybe we want this text over here to be replaced with our own arguments. Now, first, let's start with arguments. So let's say we want to pass some sort of arguments. I can call this txt or something like that. Now, usually you'll see people call this variable props, but it really doesn't matter. That's a variable that you pass to this function. Let's just, for now, just console log that variable props. Now, to be able to now pass props to that function, well, if I was using the regular way in JavaScript, I would just remove this and type header, open close parentheses, and right here, as an argument, I could just pass this is my text. So let's say we pass text as an argument to this function. So if I save this right now, and also save this one, and go back and reload this, see, it says this is my text. So we're able to pass that argument to that function, and we're console logging that argument within that function, and it works. Now we should be able to use that in our JSX by doing this syntax of brackets. And that will allow us now to pass those variables in here. This is going to be now rendering that variable in here called props. And if I save this and we go back and take a look, you'll see that there it is. We have my text in there. And that's basically the variable we pass. Let's refresh this. It should be, this is my text. That's the variable we pass from here. And that goes to our function as properties, and we render it over here. Now, if you need to pass more than one thing to this function, well, you can comma separate those different properties, but that's usually not a great idea. So usually what you could do, you can just pass them as an object. So for example, if I go back here, instead of doing this, let's say I need to pass a couple of different things. So I could just create JavaScript object right in here as I'm calling that function and say the text within this is this. And then I could say CL, and I'll use it for a class, is green, right? And we could just also move this here on top. But for now, I'm going to run this in line Now at this point, we're passing this object here with these two properties. So to be able to get to those, we basically have to do props. It refers to that object. And then if we do dot text, that should be this. And then dot CL should be this. So right now, this should be replaced with props text if I wanted to render correctly. But if I save this and go back and reload, see, it says this is my text and green. Those are the console logs we get from that. So if I wanted now to render that green here instead of red, what I would have to do, now this is something to be careful about. You don't want to do this brackets here inside of the quotes and then pass your props like this. You don't need your quotations here. So you're going to just do this like that. I'm going to remove this console logs at this point. And if I save this and go back and take a look, let's actually look at our HTML. You'll see that, see, we passed the class green and we have it in our HTML. So it works just fine. And we have it now this way. Now, the reason I converted it to this way is because JSX also has a way to run functions and also pass these parameters to it. So let me just copy paste this line, comment this line, and I'll have the second line the JSX way. So basically, instead of doing this, if we want to, if you remember, run that function, we would basically do that function name and then this HTML-like syntax. Now, how do we pass arguments to this function that we run? So the way you pass arguments to that function, you go here and type text equals, and then in quotes, you basically provide whatever that value is going to be. And then we can do another one, CL equals, and then pass green. And what's going to happen here is basically going to pass this as an object with these two properties, exactly like this, to that function. So if I just save this without changing anything else, this should be equivalent to me doing that line I did before in the previous line. Let me just zoom out a little bit. So if I save this, go back and reload, it should work exactly the same way. So at that point, we can access that here, see, from this props object and basically just get the CL and text. It's kind of unnecessary to have this props object here because we only care about what's in it. We only care about the CL and text. So one way you can simplify this, instead of passing this props as a variable here, you can just do this destructuring or deconstruction, whatever this is called in JavaScript. So basically this brackets. And here we can basically just take from that object that text and CL properties that we pass here. And at this point, we should just have access to those without having to refer to that props object, just like that. So now we should have this text that should be this text from here. And the CL should be this CL from here. And if I save this and reload, as you can see, it works exactly the same way. And this is what we call a component usually in React. This is what we call a functional component because as you can see, it's basically just a JavaScript function. We basically just run that JavaScript function that returns this, which is essentially something like that. And then we use it and we basically render it on our page. So the final thing I'm going to cover in this particular part is that sometimes you'll need multiple things rendered on the page. So what if we want this header function not only to just give us an H1, we want another maybe small text below this, another paragraph below this. Now the way you can do that, you can actually return an array back from this function. So what I can do, I can create an array here. And in array, this will be our first element. So then what I can do, I can just do a comma and then return a second thing in this array. So I can also do, let's say, a small element, subtitle. So at this point with this array with two items in it. If I save this and go back and take a look, see it rendered both of them. And what happened? H1 loaded first and small next. So if I wanted another item next line, all I had to do is just do another comma and do another item here, basically another thing in our array. So just as an example, I'll just do a paragraph, just type more text right within this paragraph. So basically now we have this array with 3 things in it. If I save this, you'll see that it's going to render all 3 of them. See, H1, small, and paragraph. This is a very important thing to understand, is that when we return, we have 2 options for our rendering to handle. We can either pass a single element or we can pass an array of elements. Now, very often people don't like doing this though, but this has its own uses. What I'm going to do, I'm going to get back to just a single element, H1. Now, what if you didn't want to do an array like that? And what you wanted to do, you wanted to do something like this, right? Something that you would usually do in HTML. You would go to the next line and do like small and then say my subtitle and then go to the next line. As you can see, my editor already complains about it because it knows this is not correct. Something like this. So as you can see, this doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that when we return something from a function, it cannot be this. Basically, a function can only return one thing. So it can be an array, or it can be an element, or whatever it is. We cannot just stack this thing like this. It doesn't work. So one way to get around this so that the function has one thing to return is to put these in an element. So let me just go on top here and create a div. So this div basically will be that JSX div React element. And then within that, we can just move all of these lines. And what's going to happen now, you'll see my editor stops complaining about this. And if I save this, this is going to work. And then I'm going to explain you why that works. So I'm going to save this, go back. And if I go back, see, it just works. And we got that div. And we got this H1 small and P inside of this. And we're just fine. Now, the reason for that is because, again, JSX, what it does, it basically takes this div element. It creates that div element. And then it creates this and this and this as a child inside of that element. So basically it handles all our like nesting of appending one element inside of another element, inside of another element, all of that. And it basically returns one element. So we can just return that element inside of this div. Now you will also very often see people wrapping this in parentheses like this. As you can see, that's not really necessary. It works either way, but if you see that, don't get confused. I'm going to remove that anyways. And the other interesting thing here is that when I save this and go back, you may have noticed that unlike the previous one when I did with arrays, we now actually have that div on top. When I just did with an array return, I didn't have the div. I just had my H1 small and P. Now, because of this, what they did, they've created this thing called fragment. So what that means is that what do? You create this thing without a name. This is what's called a fragment in JSX. And what it allows you to do, it basically says, okay, we know this is some sort of element, but we don't want this to render actually on the page. But because we need to return one element, we can do this. So we can save this now. Now, because of this, it's going to create one element with all of this. And then if we go back and take a look, see, it doesn't have that div. We just have our H1 small and P. One of the most common problems that you'll see people having, because this looks a lot like HTML, they will tend to just go here and do something like class equals whatever the class it is. So this is not valid. So remember, because we have this structure here, this cannot be class. This should be class name. So these are sort of things you have to pay attention to. And other things like, for example, if you're creating like input elements, so you would usually just do type text, and then you would just close this. Now, as you can see, it has this closing input now that it shows me. And if I save this and go back, we actually have this input element here. Now, as you can see, it rendered that input, and here there's no closing like input tag, but here it actually has that closing input tag. So here we don't have valid like HTML5. The way you would do this in HTML5, you would not have this, but if I save this, this is not going to work. We're going to get an error. See? So what you could do, you could just do this closing, self-closing, and that should work too. And that's the way you would probably most likely see those input elements. You will see that here it still doesn't render that closing tag. So it does it as an HTML5, but here, because it's JSX, we have to kind of work with that. But overall, hopefully this idea makes sense. And I will end this video on this and we'll continue on the next video.